Picture this, it's 1915. You're a naval aviator, which means you are either very brave, very stupid, or some combination of both that military recruiters love to call spirited. You're sitting in a Curtiss Model F flying boat, an ungainly contraption of wood, wire and canvas that looks like someone strapped a boat hull to a pair of fabric wings and then dared the laws of physics to say something about it. You are perched on a metal track. The track is mounted on the deck of an armored cruiser, the USS North Carolina, steaming through Pensacola Bay, Florida. Behind you, a compressed air mechanism is coiled up like a spring, straining at its leash. There is no ejector seat, there is no abort procedure, and there is no simulator. No one has done this before, especially not from a moving ship, not like this. The signal is given, the mechanism fires, and you, Lieutenant Commander Henry C. Mustin, are in the most literal way being launched into the history books. Hi everybody and welcome back to the Jackson Talks channel. Today we're going full throttle on one of the most underappreciated engineering stories in the history of naval warfare, the aircraft catapult. Specifically, we're covering Part 1, the early years, the compressed air experiments, the gunpowder launches, and the hydraulic systems of the Second World War. In addition, the desperate, slightly unhinged attempts to fling aircraft off merchant ships in the middle of the North Atlantic with no way to get them back. Part 2 will cover the Cold War revolution, the steam catapult, the British genius who made it possible, and how a piece of kit designed in post-war Edinburgh ended up being the reason American supercarriers could project nuclear power anywhere on the globe. But that's next time. Today, we start at the very beginning, and the beginning, as with so many things in aviation, involves someone falling into a river. So why does a ship need to throw an aeroplane? Before we can talk about catapults, we need to ask the obvious question: why do you need one in the first place? An aircraft, in theory, takes off by accelerating down a runway until it reaches flying speed, the point at which the wings are moving fast enough through the air to generate enough lift to get the whole thing airborne. That's simple enough on land. You've got a runway, you've got the room, sorted. Now put the aircraft on a ship. At this time a ship, unless you are designing a vessel the length of a small county, does not have a runway. Even the largest warships of the early 20th century were a few hundred feet long at most. Propeller-driven aircraft of the era needed anywhere from a few hundred feet to over half a mile to build up flying speed from a standing start. The math simply didn't work. Now, they did have some workarounds though. Cruisers and battleships could crane their float planes over the side, let them bob about on the ocean, and have them take off from the water's surface. This sounds perfectly reasonable until you consider that it required the ship to stop completely, spend a significant amount of time vulnerable in potentially hostile waters, and then wait patiently for the aircraft to splash back down alongside so it could be craned back aboard. The whole process was about as tactically sensible as stopping a cavalry charge to water the horses. The alternative, and this is the elegant engineering solution that would dominate naval aviation thinking for the next 4 decades, was to give the aircraft a shove, a very large, very fast shove. This in effect did the work of the runway. So they chose to build a machine that could take a stationary aircraft and in a fraction of a second, bring it up to flying speed, at which point it could simply fly away. I give you the catapult. Simple in concept, nightmarish in execution, and absolutely critical to the development of naval aviation as we know it. The idea of launching an aircraft by external means predates naval aviation entirely. Samuel Pierpont Langley, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, used spring-loaded catapults to launch his unmanned aerodrome flying models as early as 1896. His little steam-powered No. 5 made 2 successful flights, both well over half a mile after being flung off a houseboat on the Potomac River. It was genuinely impressive. Then in 1903, Langley tried to scale the concept up to a full piloted aircraft, twice, with the press watching, with government money on the line. It did not go well. On October the 7th, 1903, Langley's massive great aerodrome was loaded onto the catapult mechanism atop his purpose-built houseboat. He released the springs, the machine lurched forward, and according to one reporter present, it fell into the Potomac like a handful of wet mortar. His pilot, chief engineer Charles Manley, was fished out of the river unharmed. Langley tried again on December the 8th, 1903. The rear wing collapsed before the aircraft even left the catapult. Manley went into the river again. 9 days later, the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk without a catapult. Langley never worked on aircraft again. He died in 1906, reportedly with his sense of destiny entirely shattered. The Wright brothers, incidentally, did use a catapult in later years. It was a simple falling weight and derrick system to help get them airborne on calmer days. That said, they didn't rely on it. Their genius was in the control surfaces, not the launch mechanism. The United States Navy would properly weaponize the idea. In the summer of 1912, the Navy set up a compressed air catapult at Santee Dock in Annapolis. The first attempt, made by Lieutenant Theodore Ellison, officially Naval Aviator No. 1, ended with the aircraft crashing headfirst into the river. The catapult had accelerated the nose up too aggressively, stalling the aircraft. Ellison, to his considerable credit, was unhurt. They adjusted the catapult in order to hold the aircraft level throughout the launch, rather than simply sitting it on the track. On November 12, 1912, at the Washington Navy Yard, Ellison tried again, this time successfully, in a Curtiss AH-3. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't elegant, but it worked. The United States Navy had for the first time launched a piloted aircraft by catapult. The catapult was then boxed up and shipped south with the rest of the Naval Aviation Camp to the newly established Naval Air Station at Pensacola in Florida. By 1915, the Navy was refining its catapult technology and needed a test platform. Lacking anything more glamorous, they fitted the catapult to coal barge number 214, a 170-ton, 110-foot by 30-foot workhorse that had been stationed near Key West. By the April it was ready. Now, the story of the first launch from coal barge 214 is, frankly, one of my favorite pieces of early aviation history. The pilot assigned to the first test was one Lieutenant P.N. Bellinger. According to accounts, Bellinger arrived at the barge on the morning of the launch, having enjoyed a rather spirited evening the night before. He reportedly vomited twice before climbing into the cockpit of the Curtiss AB-2 flying boat. The aircraft was hoisted onto the track. The barge was pointed into the wind. The catapult fired. There was a glorious feeling, Bellinger later recalled. Everything worked beautifully. As soon as I was in the air, I was a well man. Naval aviation history is full of remarkable quotes, but that one might just be one of my favorite. The test was a success. The catapult was promptly transferred from the coal barge to the armored cruiser USS North Carolina. On the November 5, 1915, Lieutenant Commander Henry C. Mustin made the first ever catapult launch from a moving ship underway. Aviation had gone to sea, properly, practically, permanently. Here's something that surprises a lot of people. Right up until the outbreak of the Second World War, catapult development wasn't primarily about aircraft carriers. It was about battleships and cruisers. The USS Langley was commissioned in 1922, converted from a collier, but in those early decades, the naval establishment's thinking was still rooted in the big gun surface fleet. Carriers were experimental, interesting, potentially useful, but battleships were still the capital ships, and the admirals, well, they wanted their battleships to have eyes in the sky. Those eyes came in the form of floatplanes. They were used as scout aircraft that could be launched from the ship to range ahead, spot enemy formations, correct gunfire, and relay back the intelligence that the fleet needed. The interwar period saw a flurry of innovation with catapult power sources. The US Navy was particularly systematic about this, designating their catapult types by letter: A4 compressed air, H4 hydraulics, F4 flywheel, and P for gunpowder. Compressed air, or the Type A, was the original, and it worked. The mechanism would use a high-pressure air reservoir to drive a piston down the track, accelerating the carriage and aircraft to flying speed. The main problem was a practical one. Those air reservoirs were bulky, took up significant space, and had to be recharged by compressor after every single launch. If you needed to launch aircraft quickly, or launch multiple aircraft in succession, you had a problem. The flywheel catapults, or the Type F, were an interesting approach, storing kinetic energy in a rapidly spinning mass and then releasing it in a single burst. They worked tolerably well but had their own mechanical complexity and were never the primary choice. Then there was gunpowder. On December 14, 1924, they launched a Martin M01 observation plane from the USS Langley using a catapult powered by a gunpowder charge. The mechanism was, in essence, similar to the breech of a large naval gun. A propellant charge was fired, drove a piston. The piston drove the aircraft's carriage down the track, and the aircraft was flung into the air. Simple, violent, but effective. This meant for battleships and cruisers, where power sources posed practical difficulties with space and recharge times, the gunpowder catapult, the Type P, became the standard. By 1923, the Type P Mark III was being tested aboard USS Mississippi. The Omaha-class cruisers was the first American warships designed from the outset with catapults as a built-in feature. Each launch used a cartridge not unlike those found in a 130mm naval gun. They were essentially shooting their own scout planes off the deck with the mechanical equivalent of a scaled-up pistol. The catapults were mounted in various configurations depending on the ship. The cleanest arrangement, and the one American battleship settled on, was a rotating platform on the quarterdeck at the stern. Two catapults, pointing aft, could be trained into the wind regardless of the ship's heading. This was critical. You had to launch into the wind to get maximum airspeed over the wings, and a fixed catapult pointing forward meant the ship had to maneuver to create the right conditions. The British Royal Navy, with different ship designs and different operational priorities, tended toward cross-deck catapults mounted amidships. These spanned the width of the ship and could train in a full arc. They were less elegant, took up more deck space, but their seaplanes were heavier. The Supermarine Walrus amphibian required a launch force of 4 tons to get airborne, and there wasn't really a better option. Meanwhile, some navies got creative. The Japanese Imperial Navy put catapults atop the gun turrets on several of their cruisers and battleships. This saved deck space but created its own problems, with having to route compressed air lines through a structure designed to revolve and fire enormous shells. Even submarines got in on the act, with multiple nations developing submarine-launched floatplanes during the interwar period, with Japan eventually deploying the extraordinary I-400 class, capable of carrying 3 HEM-6 Siren attack floatplanes in a waterproof hangar. But this is all still the fringes of the story. The main event fitting catapults on carriers was developing more slowly, and for a somewhat counterintuitive reason. Here's the part that always surprises people when they dig into the history. For most of the Second World War, aircraft carriers didn't routinely use catapults for their operations. They had them by the mid-1930s. The hydraulic catapult was being developed specifically for flush deck carriers. The first successful carrier hydraulic catapult tests were conducted at the Naval Aircraft Factory in 1935, launching aircraft of 5,500 pounds at 45 miles per hour in just 34 feet. But in practice, most carrier aircraft launches during the war were deck runs. The aircraft simply used the full length of the flight deck to accelerate under its own power. This was because the propeller-driven aircraft were remarkably good at generating lift at low speeds. A big radial engine pushing a large diameter propeller creates enormous airflow over the wings even when the aircraft is moving relatively slowly. In a 30-knot headwind, which a carrier steaming at speed into a breeze can generate, a fully loaded Grumman TBF Avenger or a Vought F4U Corsair could get airborne from a few hundred feet of deck run without any assistance. Catapults were reserved for specific circumstances such as heavy aircraft, light wind conditions, night launches where the blacked-out deck made a full-length run more hazardous. Then there was the small escort carriers that had a deck that was simply too short for an unassisted takeoff at times. After 1943, most came fitted with them as standard. By the end of the war, some carriers were making 40% of their launches by catapult. At the start of the conflict, it had been close to zero. The catapult was still a supporting player in the carrier story. Its starring role was coming, but first the war had some extraordinary chapters to write. The Battle of the Atlantic was, at its core, a logistics problem. Germany needed to cut Britain's supply lines. Britain needed to keep them open. In the years before long-range maritime patrol aircraft became available in sufficient numbers, there was a window of vulnerability in the middle of the Atlantic, beyond the range of shore-based aircraft from either side, where convoys traveled blind. Where Focke-Wulf, FW-200 Condor, maritime patrol bombers could circle unmolested, radioing convoy positions to the U-boat wolfpacks below. The Condor was not, technically speaking, a wonderful aircraft. It had been designed as a civilian airliner, and Lufthansa had been operating it on prestige routes before the war. But in its maritime reconnaissance role, armed with bombs and cannon, it was an absolute menace to Allied convoys. Churchill himself called it the scourge of the Atlantic. The obvious solution of fighter cover was for a long time impossible. Escort carriers were still being built. The distances involved were too great for land-based fighters. So someone had an idea that was either inspired or deranged, depending on your perspective. Why not fit catapults to merchant ships, then we could launch a hurricane? The catapult aircraft merchantmen or CAM ships were exactly what they sound like, ordinary merchant vessels, tankers and freighters and cargo ships, fitted with a forward-mounted catapult and a single Sea Hurricane fighter. The scheme was operationally straightforward. When a Condor appeared, the Hurricane was launched. It then engaged, drove off or destroyed the threat. Then, because there was no way to land a Hurricane back on a ship that had no flight deck, the pilot had to ditch in the Atlantic and hope the convoy's escort vessels could fish him out before hypothermia or drowning made the whole thing moot. These were, in every meaningful sense, one-way missions. The aircraft was expended. The pilot, if he survived, then required to be rescued. The catapult mechanisms on these ships were essentially glorified rocket assist launch rigs. A solid fuel rocket booster provided the initial kick. The aircraft cleared the bow, and then the pilot was on his own, ending up in potentially hostile and certainly freezing North Atlantic water. Between 1941 and 1943, there were 8 combat launches from CAM ships. Of those, at least 6 resulted in the enemy aircraft being driven off or shot down. The vast majority of pilots survived. The rescue procedures, while improvised, worked more often than not. The camships were a stopgap, a desperate wartime solution to a desperate problem, and they were rendered obsolete the moment proper escort carriers began arriving in sufficient numbers. The last operational camship launch was in 1943, but the men who flew those missions deserve to be remembered. They climbed into fighters with no deck to land on, in the middle of the ocean, and they flew anyway. While the camships were flying their dramatic one-way sorties over the Atlantic, the more prosaic, but arguably more strategically significant work of the battleship and cruiser catapult aviation was continuing in every theater of the war. The workhorse of American catapult aviation was the Vortos 2U Kingfisher, a compact, single-engine floatplane of extraordinary versatility. The Kingfisher served aboard virtually every class of American battleship and cruiser throughout the conflict. Its job was observation and spotting, flying ahead of the fleet, identifying targets, and correcting the fall of shot during bombardments. It rescued downed pilots from hostile waters. It flew liaison missions. It was, in the unglamorous but essential category of naval aircraft, one of the war's great unsung tools. A Kingfisher being launched from, say, USS Iowa was an unspectacular but efficient operation. The aircraft was craned or rolled onto the catapult, the crew climbed aboard, and the gunpowder charge was fired. The aircraft went from 0 to 50 miles per hour in about 70 feet in roughly 1 second. The G-forces involved were considerable for the time, about 2.5 to 3 G. After its mission, the aircraft would land alongside the ship on the water, taxi up to a drogued cable trailed astern, hook on, and be winched back aboard by crane. The British equivalent was the Supermarine Walrus, an amphibian biplane with a pusher engine mounted between its wings with an aerodynamic profile of an extremely confused seagull. It was nonetheless beloved by its crews for being reliable, forgiving, and virtually indestructible. Walruses rescued downed airmen from the Mediterranean, Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and the waters around the Pacific Islands. They were launched by the hydraulic catapults fitted to Royal Navy cruisers and battleships, and they were in service until the end of the war. Meanwhile, the German Kriegsmarine was running its own catapult aviation program, the Arado AR-196, a sleek monoplane floatplane far more modern-looking than the Walrus, was fitted to virtually every major German surface unit. The Bismarck carried 2. The Prinz-Eugen carried several. They were used for reconnaissance, for anti-submarine patrol, and notably for the capture of the British submarine HMS Seal in 1940, which was itself something of an extraordinary episode. Catapult aviation was, for the first years of the war, a global industry. Between 43 and 44, the strategic picture was changing. Carriers were now available in sufficient numbers that every major fleet operation could include adequate air cover. Radar was improving. Shore-based aircraft were extending their range. The niche that the battleship floatplane had occupied, giving capital ships their own organic reconnaissance capability, was being eroded from multiple directions simultaneously. The catapult turntables on American battleships began to come off. The scout floatplane squadrons were either disbanded or reassigned. By 1945, most American battleships and cruisers had their catapult equipment removed entirely, the deck space repurposed for additional anti-aircraft guns as the threat from Japanese air attack became the dominant tactical concern. The era of the battleship catapult was essentially over, but the story of the catapult was, as we will see, very far from finished. Because while the battleship floatplane was fading into history, a new problem was emerging, one that would make everything that had gone before look like a gentle warm-up act. The jet engine changed everything about aviation. It certainly changed everything about carrier aviation in particular, and not in a good way. Well, not at first. The problem was fundamental. A jet engine, unlike a piston engine driving a large propeller, generates thrust by pushing a stream of hot gas backward. It does not, in the process, push any air over the aircraft's wings like the prop would. In addition, a prop-driven aircraft sitting at the start of a carrier deck, in a 30-knot headwind, needs less airflow before it gets lift. A jet aircraft, sitting on the same deck in the same conditions, needs to be moving considerably faster before those wings generate enough lift to get the aircraft airborne. The early carrier jets such as the Grumman F-9F Panther, the McDonnell F-2H Banshee and the de Havilland Vampire in Royal Navy service could just about manage it. They were relatively light, and the hydraulic catapults of the era could, with effort, just about get them up to flying speed. But the aircraft were getting heavier, faster, more capable and therefore more demanding of the machinery that had to launch them. By the early 1950s, the United States Navy had plans that the existing hydraulic catapults simply could not support. The Bureau of Aeronautics wanted a carrier-based nuclear bomber, a genuine, long-range, nuclear-armed aircraft that could strike targets deep inside the Soviet Union from the deck of an American carrier. That aircraft would become the Douglas Sky Warrior. It weighed roughly 3 times as much as a contemporary jet fighter. It needed to be accelerated to roughly the same takeoff speed. The hydraulic catapults fitted to American carriers, the H-8, the most powerful in service, could barely manage the much lighter A.J. Savage, a short-range nuclear bomber that itself stretched the system to its limits. The numbers were clear. The existing technology wasn't going to cut it. Something fundamentally different was needed, and it was going to come from a somewhat unexpected direction. In Edinburgh, Scotland, a Royal Navy volunteer reserve officer named Commander C.C. Mitchell, working for a firm called Brown Brothers and Company, had been thinking about steam. In particular, how you use steam to launch a 30-ton aircraft down a flight deck at 150 miles per hour in a few seconds. In Part 2, we're covering Commander Mitchell's revolutionary design, the trials aboard HMS Perseus, the American adoption of the steam catapult, how it made nuclear deterrence viable at sea, and why the Steamcat is still flinging aircraft off carrier decks to this day. So if you enjoyed this one, subscribe, give a thumbs up and comment below. Thanks for watching, and join me in the next video as we continue our journey on the development of naval catapults.